Fun. You like it, I like it. Stupid. While most of my favorites are chunky epics, big epic high fantasy time, I don't want to read them back to back. Quite often I do like some shorter, just fun reads. Especially with it being summer, I do like reading just more fun, not got a steep learning curve. I don't need to memorize thousands of pages of lore. So given that is kind of getting on in summer, I thought I would finally pull together a list of some just fun fantasy and sci-fi reads that you might want to read over the summer, or what's left of it. I've not got any specific specifications for these books. They just have to be, for the most part, relatively short and just a fun, fast read for summer. We don't do rules here. We just go with it. First up, we have The Combat Codes. Now this is a new release. It was originally self-published and it just got republished by Orbit. The Combat Codes is a sci-fantasy that's very training oriented. So in this world, political disputes are resolved by fighting. So each country kind of have their own league of warriors that they then battle or send out to these fights against other chosen warriors from other countries, and then whoever the winner is wins that case. So it's quite often disputes over who owns the land. And the whole idea is that these warriors will fight for their country instead of having these huge wars. In the country we follow, there are the Grievers, which are these elite warriors that they send out for political disputes. And one of their tenets is, "We fight, so the rest shall not." And that's just a perfect way of putting how this world kind of works. The book opens following Murray, a retired Griever who was kind of more forced out than retired. He's a wee bit more washed up now, and he now is a scout that's looking for more of these Griever warriors to bring up to train for his country. And that's when we're introduced to Seagull, the second point of view. Who's this boy with kind of a bit of a mysterious past? We get snippets of it and you kind of learn more about his past as we go on. And Murray tries to buy Seagull so he can train him up to be one of these Griever warriors. It feels very Karate Kid in that. It feels like the master then trained this old grizzled master, then training this younger apprentice in the ways of fighting. It has a lot of really familiar but fun tropes. It's a bit like this grizzled old mentor. It's got some really good training sequences. It has this sort of found family trope in it as well. I was also really surprised about how much world building is included in this. I thought it would be very character and political focused, which it does have a lot of. But the fighting takes place in these rings, and these rings are made of different materials, and each material kind of has its own effect. So some can really bring out the anger in the fighters to make it a more brutal fight, and part of the training that these Griever Knights go through is trying to not fall to the influence of these different circles. And all these amazing training sequences just make me want to go work out. Next up we have Neon Ghosts, A Witch's Sin, which is Daniel Green's, yes that Daniel Green's, new novel that just came out this month. A lot of new releases in this video. That wasn't on purpose, just they fell into the category. This is a cyberpunk sci-fantasy book that's very detective and investigation type story. It follows Taya Mint, who is an enforcer, which in my video when I was reading it I called her a freelance police officer, which is the most terrible phrasing that I could have gone with. She's like a mercenary. That's a better way of doing it. She's a mercenary who gets hired to kind of rough up these criminals. This is until she falls into this bigger political plot. The thing that really got me with this one is the setting. So society lives in these massive mega structures, which are these huge metal buildings with tons and tons of floors, and each floor kind of has a different type of aesthetic, and it also plays a lot into the social hierarchy. So being lower down is kind of for the criminals and more of the underworld type characters in the story, whereas your richer noble types live higher up in the structure. And also there's vampires. You might think cyberpunk with vampires is a bizarre setup, but Daniel Green really makes it work. It fits so well into the world that I now want vampires in all my cyberpunk stories. And there's so much to the world building because The reason that they live in these huge megastructures is because the world had something happen to it that created this haze that kills people, so they all had to hide in these metal structures that they created. There's so much to the world building that I can tell that Daniel Green is really setting up a series here. So while you're going on this investigation journey of learning more about the political structure and the missing kid that Thea Min is looking into, you also learn a lot about the world building, which is really fun. There's lots of different themes touched on in this book, but I really liked how Daniel Green handled grief in this book. I did find occasionally it was told rather than shown, but I do think overall he did a really good job of showing grief in this book, and I thought it was really well done. That doesn't make it sound like a fun read, but I promise it is. Vampires cyberpunk. That's the fun part. It's worth reading. Super fun, I swear. Next up, we have A Master of Djinn. Now, I have mentioned this book a good number of times on this channel already, but I'm mentioning it again. Also, Mr. Clark, if we could get like a sequel, that would be... I'd like that. This is an Egyptian 1912 Cairo alternate history steampunk detective fantasy book. I think that just sells it. Do I need to say any more than that? In this world, there was an incident that ripped a hole in the fabric of the world and let in all these jinn and angels and different creatures. And the man who opened it is called Al-Jahiz, but then very soon after he went missing and just disappeared. But at the start of this book, the Brotherhood of Al-Jahiz, which is kind of like a cult who still think he's around somewhere, all get murdered by a man claiming to be Al-Jahiz returned. So this follows Detective Fatima, who's looking into the murder of this cult. They call themselves a brotherhood, but it's a cult. This is just a fast-paced, fun detective story, perfect for a summer holiday. The description work in this book is absolutely terrific. It really makes you feel like you are in 1912 Cairo. He talks about the cable cars crackling on wires above. You can really smell the spices from the markets. Clark really does bring this world to life. I do think it's probably worth reading A Dead Djinn in Cairo, which is a novella, a prequel novella, because this book kind of does spoil it. But I do think that reading the novella will give you a good taste of the world and these characters, and it will probably make you want to pick up A Master of Djinn very quickly afterwards. Next up, we have Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. Now this is great because it is a standalone for now. There is meant to be a sequel at some point, well, more than one sequel at some point in the future, but for now, this is just a one and done, and also you don't need to have read anything else from Sanderson, so you can read this as a starting point into his work. Warbreaker is about these two sisters. One is promised to be married off to the God King, who is a king who's kind of like a god. Just get that out. But the last second, the sister who's brought up and trained to become this wife is swapped out for the other sister, who was never ever trained to do anything like this, and is sent away down south to marry this God King. As you would expect, the world building and magic system is absolutely top notch. It has this sort of color magic. People who can use it can drain color from things and then animate other objects. Very simplified version, but it's really cool. And in this world, they have people called the Returned, who are treated as gods because they died and then came back, but they never have any memories of their own past. And one of the point of views is one of these gods, these Returned, called Lightsong, and he's one of my favorite characters that Brandon Sanderson has written. He's really funny because he doesn't think he is a god. So despite the fact that he is treated as a god, he's convinced he's not a god. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of humour and shenanigans around that. Be aware though that this one does break the short rule. It's about 650 pages. Well worth the read. Next up, we have a book that I read years ago, and I can't actually remember that much other than it's very tonally similar to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and that is Colony by Rob Grant. Rob Grant is one of the minds behind Red Dwarf, so if you've ever seen that, it's kind of like that, tonally wise anyway. So it's very sarcastic and silly and kind of funny. The book opens up with the world being doomed, and we follow Eddie, who is just kind of an idiot. And at the start of the book, he gets himself into the situation where he swaps places with a genius scientist and gets on one of the last ships that breaks off from Earth and escapes before they all die. The problem is, he's not a genius scientist, he's an idiot. This is a super short read, it's just a fun little adventure, it's really silly. If you like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's definitely one to pick up and try out. I know I've already done a Sanderson book, but if we're talking about fun summer reads, I can't not mention Tress. This was the first secret project that Sanderson released in January, and it's a fairy tale-esque seafaring adventure with inspiration from The Princess's Bride. So Tress lives on this island where nothing ever happens, but she's content on her little island of not very much happening until her friend Charlie, who left the island, needs saving. So Tress needs to go out on a seafaring adventure and save him. This is a very different story from Sanderson's other works. I really loved the prose style. It is very fairy tale-esque in the way it is written. It's got a very jovial tone, especially because it is narrated by Hoyt. There also is a fair bit of humour in this book, and of course, Sanderson, world building, magic system, top notch as always, because the sea is not a sea as you would imagine it. It is a sea of spores. And just like Warbreaker, you can read this without reading anything else from Sanderson's work. I do think you would get more from it if you know who Hoyt is, but you certainly don't need to. The second last book is The Lies of Locke, Lamora. Again, it kind of breaks the short book rule, but it's well worth the page count. This follows Locke Lamora, funnily enough, who's part of a band of thieves who worship this god of stealing, pretty much. And this found family aspect to this band of thieves is just really wholesome. And some of the heists that they pull off are just so much fun to read. They're just really cool and smart and interesting. And there is also a lot of humor in this book too. That's kind of a theme throughout this video as well. The world is pretty low on magic. There's not a lot of magic involved. But this book has so much style. It feels like a Venice-esque setting. And just the way it's written is just so very stylized and just great fun. See that? Full circle. I do have one more book series I want to mention, but I haven't read it, so I felt like it was a cheat to include it in the number. But that would be Discworld. You'll need to go elsewhere if you want to learn more about Discworld, but they're pretty short reads, they're very funny, and they just sound like a lot of fun. So if you're looking for further fun summer reads, that's definitely a series you'll want to check out. I should probably say my book is quite fun. And it's a desert setting, making it perfect for summer. Now will do it for today. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know in the comments below your favourite fun, fantasy or sci-fi book, and what are you planning on reading this summer? Okay, I'm done. Outro. Very training oriented, and it is a sci-fantasy, very training oriented, it is a sci-fantasy, very training oriented. I did say it right that time. Oh, it should have just committed.